Hello, everyone. Welcome to It's Bit Academical podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Jutta Tobias Mortlock, a social psychologist with a distinguished career in research and teaching mindfulness. Dr. Mortlock, or Jutta, has brought mindfulness to a wide range of audiences, including university students to the British military. Dr. Mortlock research has been, or Utah's research has been recognized by both academic and mainstream audiences, appearing in publications ranging from peer-reviewed journals to major news outlets. We are excited to have Dr. Mortlock to the show today, and it's going to be an amazing conversation. And I'm so looking forward to it. And let's get to it. How are you doing? How is everything after a long time?
It's wonderful to see you and to speak to you again. I'm well, and I am perhaps full of even more excitement this year than last year, because as we've just talked about, I love my work, and with the potential to understand AI and its contribution deeply, I feel like we're at the cusp of, or maybe a decision point. That's a really important decision point. Also, from the perspective of mindfulness, because mindfulness is all about understanding deeply in order to transform suffering. And as we've just said before we even started this official podcast, understanding AI deeply in order to understand the causes of why we're suffering, or maybe why we're suffering in relation to AI, maybe an opportunity to transform ourselves as well as society. Go ahead.
Just in this little 5 minutes, or no, 2 minutes, you've said like quite a few important, relevant, and kind of, I would say, insightful statements.
Well,
I want to,
thanks for flattering me here.
I want to get back to it. However, but before I do or any of that, I want to kind of ask the obvious question. Please tell us a little bit about you, so that we kind of effectively get acquainted.
Mhm.
Well, when I say everybody is listening.
Fantastic. Well, I'm this German girl that left Germany some 30 years ago when I started studying. Started in IT consultancy, spent almost a decade leading a very privileged life of working with a host of companies, being invited to understand their problems and invited to help them understand business processes and their IT strategy and implementation. And I realized during that time that I really loved people and I loved understanding what people did. So I went back to school in the US, did a doctorate in social psychology, and have now been an academic for 14 years already. So I'm older than I think I am in my head, but is about understanding people as opposed to business processes. And people are, of course, at the core of business processes. And something like 10 or 12 years ago, I came across mindfulness as a door opener to help people make better decisions, both in life and in work life. And my focus as an academic, I work at City University of London right now, City St George's University of London. We've just merged with the medical school.
Amazing.
My focus is on understanding and then help people at work feel as well as do better. So it's all about well-being and performance at work. That's my work.
So that's a very interesting point. So even before we get into this idea of mindfulness, if for someone who probably doesn't know anything about it, how would you define what mindfulness is, like in a very concise way? Maybe is there a way? It's quite a difficult topic, I would think.
I think there's so much talked about mindfulness, and it's almost there's so many trees in the forest that the forest feels like it's difficult to even understand the forest or to see the wood for the trees. Okay, mindfulness is mental practice with two purposes. And the two purposes of mindfulness, mental practice, that means you doing something with your mind for two reasons. One, you want to understand something deeply. And the second reason is because you want to transform what you understand in order to transform suffering. So, in a nutshell, mindfulness is what you do in your mind to deeply understand and actually transform suffering. You practice mindfulness because you accept that either you or somebody else or the world is suffering. And you want to alleviate that suffering, either for yourself or for you and somebody else or for society as a whole. So that's the purpose of mindfulness. And then there's all sorts of mechanisms or ways to get into mindfulness. One of the most popular and what most well understood methods to become mindful is sitting in silence and contemplating or reflecting on one's thoughts and feelings and impulses. And in plain English, this is called meditation, meditative practice. By organizations, mindfulness, as we're now knowing, is most useful when you're basically doing something in your mind to be mentally agile, to change the way you process information in the moment, in line with the needs of the moment. For example, right
Mm.
now, we're being analytical. We're trying to understand a concept. And so it's appropriate for me to either, lower the suffering that might be in the moment, that means you and me misunderstanding, or increasing the well-being, which is the other side of reducing suffering, by being very clear and analytical. But if the needs of the moment change, for example, you and I need to create a closer connection, or I might need to do something to my mental state, I might need to do something else with my mind. So my mental practice changes depending on the needs of the situation. And so mindfulness, the big scientific term, is actually a metacognitive practice. That means I'm thinking about the way I'm thinking. Meta means turning something onto itself. So meta is a bit like the mirror that I use with my students when I explain mindfulness. Look, I have a bit of a mirror here. And so meta means things turn onto themselves. So if I look at myself, that means I am meta aware. If I'm looking at my thoughts, that means I'm doing metacognition. And so mindfulness is a practice where I'm reflecting on whether my thoughts are helpful to alleviate my stress or suffering, or whether they're actually not helpful. And then I change the way I process information.
That is um, so what you've told me so far is that it is a such so mindfulness is a word that holds something really profound, where it's really about, you're really looking at the thoughts about the thoughts. What I mean by that
Mm-hmm.
is, because when I say, for me, metadata, as I'm looking at data, metadata is data about data, right? So when you are talking about a metacognitive process, I think what you're saying is, it's a process where you are analyzing the thoughts about the thoughts, or you are looking and observing those thoughts and understanding what they really mean, right? So it's effectively putting yourself up out of that stream and seeing what they're really about. And then what you've also said was that practice as a whole can then can transform not just yourself but everybody around you, because it is of impact, it has an effect on not just on yourself but everybody else, from the perspective of the business, that colleagues that you might be working with, but at the same time maybe your friends, anybody else that's around you can have an effect, because you are kind of immediately being, you're looking at it something from a very minute way, but also in a grand way as well, right? So you have the ability to move between these two things, which is, I think, an incredible. I'm guessing, of course, somebody has to practice that, but it's an incredible practice to have, I would say.
We all have it. It's incredible. You're calling this an incredible practice. I call it probably one of the most natural practices that humans have. We have language and we have imagination. And so we can transport ourselves into different realities through our thoughts. For example, I can transport you back to standing outside of your home by asking you, "Did you lock your front door this morning, Shirosh?" So and I say, "Did you really lock your door this morning,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Shirosh?"
yeah.
So I'm transporting you into a different reality and I'm inducing worry, hopefully not so big worry, through my language, through my
Yes,
thoughts.
yes,
So we have the ability to change our mental state by thinking and by thinking about different thoughts and by
yes.
directing our thoughts in different ways. I also have the power to influence your mental state and your thinking by asking you such a stupid, idiotic question, right? But basically, our minds create reality and they create multiple realities. It is, and the thinking about thinking is one of the most natural things that we have been doing ever since
It
we've
was
had
yes.
a prefrontal cortex. But the interesting thing about mindfulness and about its popularity is in today's world, where we're processing a lot of information, where our mental states are moving faster and faster and faster, it's almost a precious resource to even sit down and think consciously, to think deliberately, to think about the way I'm thinking. And so mindfulness is actually becoming more rare, even though it's a completely natural thing.
Right,
The
right.
other thing that's hopefully useful to say is the word mindfulness, in its original meaning, means remembering. And so mindfulness, the Sati term for mindfulness, but the original word for mindfulness basically means remembering, and it's sati.
Yeah, it's a Buddhist word, I think, is it not?
Yeah,
I'm
it's
Buddhist, so
Pali language.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
exactly.
It's Sanskrit, and it's coming from Sanskrit, isn't it? Yeah,
I think so.
yeah,
The important point about this is it is incredibly hard for most of us, including myself, in the moment to remember that I could be mindful. So
yes,
mindfulness is actually about remembering that I could be deliberate about the way I am thinking, the way I'm approaching, the way I am processing a situation. And so that's why it is a metacognitive practice. And it's a practice similar to me doing physical exercise to grow my big muscles in my arms.
yes, yes,
So the more I practice physical
yes,
exercise, the
yes,
bigger my muscles get.
yes.
The more I practice to remember to be mindful, and the more my capacity to be mindful is. And so what am I remembering? I'm remembering that by thinking and by looking deeply at what's going on between you and me, I have the chance to either understand and, more importantly, to overcome or transform the potential suffering that is in this moment.
Can I ask? So I want to come back to this point in a minute because I want to put it in. Because the whole point of this podcast really is to ensure or ask and show the work and why, in some ways, meta component of research leaders like yourself to ask the question, why did you decide to do what you're doing, right? Because you could have chosen any other thing, but you decided to do this thing. So I want to kind of go a little bit back to understand. So you at the very beginning you mentioned when you were introducing yourself, you mentioned you were doing IT consultancy, and then you went through this journey of changing your, almost I would say maybe changing your career path a little bit, and you've worked with incredible different places like Rwanda, which is a, well, everybody who knows about the situation there in the past would know how what a place that it was, and then what change it has happened over the past few years. Did my I think my question is this: you've you're talking so passionately about the mindfulness and all these cognitive practices, and then effectively adding this layer of practicality into it, so that instead of asking the question, oh yeah, it's some mindfulness, I don't really care, to elevating it to a point, no, it's not just a practice, it has real practical applications in the business world and in real life, so that you can really make, as you said earlier, suffering, transform the suffering in a different way. So I just want to go back to your journey and ask the question, did the experiences you've had maybe in your in that journey, did did those have an impact for you to choose this subject and to focus on it and to grow this practice?
Yes, of course. And it's it's actually really interesting that you're asking this, because many of us are not really talking about the word suffering in a business context, right?
Right, right.
Um, Suffering is not really an acceptable word when you're talking about leadership, when you're talking about management, when you're talking about decision making. But when I, in my 20s, worked in consulting in London and in Europe, just this was just around the millennium. Before the year 2000, money grew on trees when you were in consulting in London. People were doing, it was a very hedonistic uh, phase in the northwestern hemisphere, as it were. I then experienced a dot-com bubble burst and stay in with organizations who had to find their feet again. And that's when the suffering of employees as well as leaders and decision makers in organization became much more apparent to me than before. But in polite company, we talk about stress. And nowadays, 20 years later, we are allowing ourselves even more to say, I'm really stressed, I'm really busy, I'm really stressed, and I'm overworked, I'm overworked. I then also went to Rwanda and did my doctoral research there. And I became really interested in decision making. And so Rwanda is actually, this is literally 30 years ago that the genocide in Rwanda happened. And Rwanda has, of course, transformed itself in very many meaningful ways. And of course, we're all still concerned about many aspects of Rwandan society. Yet, the thing that I experienced whilst interviewing Hutu and Tutsi who had benefited from foreign direct investment and from a government policy that promoted entrepreneurship and that promoted entrepreneurialism in a desperate poverty context, people basically could and saw opportunities to start working together. And despite the fact that trust was very, very much broken and atrocities happened and trauma was still present when I was there in the early 2000s, that is unspeakable. So the interesting thing about human decision making is in every moment we have a choice, and the choices are the micro points that basically get you to go up in terms of well-being or go down in terms of well-being. And those micro choices are often driven by unconscious drivers, and they're almost always driven by also your ancestors or your culture or your social soup influencing your choices. And the problem often with bad decisions is not that an individual or a human is an atrocious human being, but that their decisions are not informed enough, not deliberate enough, not thoughtful enough.
Yes.
And I then, over the course of writing up my PhD, starting to work at Cranfield, teaching decision making and negotiation to executives, I realized that many of us know what we need to do. For example, in negotiation, one of the prime principles of effective negotiation is you take a break and you go to the balcony when the negotiations become too heated. And at one of the first times when I was teaching a group of senior negotiators, whether they knew about this adage of negotiation, like when things get heated, you take time out and you go to the balcony. That means you physically and mentally remove yourself from the negotiation because it becomes too heated in order to see the big picture. That's what we mean by metacognition. You want to see yourself from a distance. And everybody in that group, even though they were in their 50s and above, said, because we know about going to the balcony as a rule or as a piece of advice, but none of them had
Did
been
it.
capable of doing it in the moment. And so the knowing doing gap in executive education, in leadership decision making is huge. And the thing that is missing is awareness or remembering
To do it.
that actually I have a choice in that micro moment. And that's when I got interested in mindfulness. That mindfulness is the practice to remember, hopefully in the moment, as opposed to after the moment, that I actually have a choice. And the choice is always to either scratch the itch and just get the decision over with, act on impulse, or to slow down in order to understand more profoundly, more deeply, and in order to actually overcome my stress, maybe overcome the stress in the system, and then transform the way we relate to each other. And the golden thing that I've learned in the last 5 or 6 years in my research is actually when we slow down and when we are becoming more deliberate in how we make decisions, we realize that we're much more connected than we think we are.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You and I, we're interconnected, and you doing well is my well-being, and
Absolutely.
me doing well is your well-being. And most of us forget that. And
Absolutely.
that's why we are
Absolutely.
all
Getting
so
each other's way,
stressed, and
right?
why we feel
Yeah.
so alone, and
Yeah.
we feel so overwhelmed, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I just love this.
No, no, no. It's one of those. I mean, I need to now be careful because this actually happened with Professor Loredana as well. Is that I need to be careful to ask you the things I was supposed to ask you and not like just have a random chat like saying things that interest me, right? So I need to be careful about. But
Let's have some discipline here, right?
yes, that's
And
because
mindfulness is actually a mental discipline, right? Let's stay focused.
yeah, no, it's not. It's nothing you're doing. It's completely my problem that I get too excited by what you're saying. It's just brilliant. Just want to ask one, going back to a little bit about what you said, like and this might be a very ignorant question because I actually don't know. I can't even understand. I can't even make an assumption about this. So the question is this. So you've started this. We met at Cranfield when you were at Cranfield, um, and at that time, looking back, where you got interested in mindfulness and talking to these executives, people who are maybe in a certain mindset about business or certain mindset about looking at the world in a way, and then transforming that approach to a academic career and an academic field. In some ways, not in some ways, you have done that. Did you not come across challenges where people came and said, yeah, mindfulness, that sounds so nice, great, it sounds very hippie stuff, but this is not the place for this. I don't really care about mindfulness. I want to get this deal done. I feel like someone who, I mean, again, this might be my assumption that would be wrong to assume, but I feel like that could be conversations that you might have had with people where people said, this is not for me. I don't care about what this mindfulness is. And then where, so to, in 10 years, you've gone from that point to people probably being very skeptical about whatever it is, mindfulness that they thought it is, to building a huge practice in a university, in a with students, with a huge influence. So how what was that journey like to build that influence and build that convincing people to say it's not a hippie thing to look at mindfulness. It's something completely profound. It's really about ourselves. How would, maybe that's wrong question, or is that
Good question. And I think it's a really important question. And I have now introduced probably more than 15,000 people to mindfulness, adult learners, most of whom have been executives or senior leaders in organization in work context, most of whom have not had an interest in mindfulness. And because of the wonderful opportunities that I've had in Cranfield over the last 14 years and at City University now, where I am, I can sneak in mindfulness in teaching leadership, teaching management skills, teaching the soft, or what Loredana Paduian calls the
Yeah.
smart skills,
Yeah.
sneaking mindfulness into leadership or professional development training. And I have a lot of war wounds along this path, so I have often got it wrong, and I've learned from getting it wrong in bringing mindfulness into leadership development and leadership training. But it still happens to me today that I teach mindfulness to senior leaders probably 2 or 3 times a month, and it literally happens every time after I introduce people to resilience, decision making, or all the other outcomes of mindfulness practice. And that somebody comes up to me and says, you know what, I thought I was going to skip this, and I had really low expectations for your setting, for your session. They kind of say to me, I'm surprised, but I've actually learned something.
Right.
And I'm very grateful for this feedback, because look, that we have a problem in management and in leadership with mindfulness because of the paradoxical popularity of mindfulness for individual stress reduction, and the popularity of mindfulness trainings in schools, in well-being centers, in communities, to help individuals who have self-declared themselves that they are struggling and that they want to have help, that they can't cope. The extreme popularity of mindfulness training for those people in those contexts has almost paradoxically made it less popular for people who might not even be aware that they could
Right.
benefit from mindfulness training, let alone to actually almost disclose that there might be some benefit for them. But so let's just come back to why people have been practicing mindfulness, or this idea of mental practice to reflect in order to understand and overcome suffering, which is what in many religions and very moral and ethical practices people have been doing for thousands of years, even though it's not a spiritual or religious practice at all. It's a practice that's practical. That
Yes.
means if you
Yes.
practice mindfulness, you
Yes.
will feel better.
Yes.
And if you feel better and your nervous system is a bit more calm and less reactive, you might actually do better. And that means your decisions might be more well informed and more solid, as opposed to a decision that you have to change. And so my path towards the success that I've experienced, or that I enjoy as being associated with having a successful mindfulness research and teaching agenda, is that um, I I invite people to practice and to experience what it feels like to slow down in their thinking, and to then reflect about to what extent this is helpful for the way they are showing up.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
mindfulness as a way of being is highly practical and
Yes.
highly useful for people in all sorts of what life, especially people in high pressured leadership
Yes.
positions.
Yes. And when you're mentioning that, I kind of had this. So our previous podcast was with Professor Calvo from Imperial College. He specializes in actually a variety of fields. One of the key points that he made in our podcast was there are these three needs, which is cognitive, which is in design thinking is cognitive, and then there is the need to be connected, uh, and and then the ability to really understand, and the to do it, be able to understand that why, and why that um, that action is being taken, and then the ability to make decisions on it, like autonomy, right? So cognitive autonomy and connectiveness. So what I think what you're saying with mindfulness is really the ability to amplify those needs that those people, anybody would want to have, and then mindfulness gives this ability to supercharge that, right? So effectively acts in another level, which of course in a business setting or in any setting that you might want to excel, what mindfulness gives you is the ability to supercharge your needs so that you perform, and you can perform better in a situation, right? So I think that's effectively it really fits together of what you're saying. And what you also said about people misunderstanding what mindfulness is, and I think it's simply a matter of, once you really understand, like at least have a little bit of an open window or a little bit of an open door to just to get a glimpse of what that is, then you'll be transformed, right, with that idea. I think and you are doing such a great job of explaining what that is, by the way. I mean, it's incredible. um, the other point that you mentioned, which is which is very interesting as well, is you've worked with executives, you worked with different people, like including British Army, Navy, and do you see that depending on the setting, depending on the profession, depending on gender, that there are variations of people's approach to mindfulness? That is to say, for example, perhaps there is more openness to adapt or look into mindfulness, perhaps male versus female, or maybe uh, people in certain geographic, like in the Western world versus Eastern world. Is there such a thing, or not really?
I think there are potential, and this is all about socialization, because the mind works in exactly the same way, whether you're male or female, or whether you are, whether you don't identify as either of the genders. So this is that the human mind works in a certain way, and the human mind is driven by two conflicting fundamental drives: to compete and to collaborate. And so we're constantly competing and we're constantly also needing to collaborate. And this is what creates our complex social reality. There are, I think, women, at least in the parts of the world that I've visited, women tend to be more open to collaboration than some men, especially in the leadership circles that I navigate in. And potentially some industries or contexts might be more open to mindfulness or not, to the word mindfulness. But the word mindfulness is not fully understood. And so this brings me to the core of my research agenda. So my research agenda is to step beyond mindfulness as an individual performance enhancing tool. And the interesting thing, and I think this is probably also why mindfulness has become a little bit controversial, both from people who want to use mindfulness as a performance enhancing tool for individuals and from those who are saying this is not in line with the original intent of Buddhist meditative practice. Most workplaces nowadays, especially high stakes, high stress workplaces such as Army, Navy, and the Royal Marines in the UK that I work with, are highly interdependent workplaces. People depend on each other much more than it would look, or than the hierarchical nature of the way the organizations look. And so therefore, the need to connect, as you said with your previous interview, the need to not only understand and have autonomy in decision making, but the need to connect with other people is actually much higher than it seems.
Yes.
And our world is becoming more fragmented and we're becoming more individualistic. Even when we're sitting in a pub, we actually look at our phones as opposed
Phones,
to making
yes.
conversations with people. Whereas the problems of this world need teams to make interdependent decisions to solve the complexity of that we are having in today's world. And so my research agenda is all about pushing the mindfulness practice not from within my own mind to include the space between you and me. And so the more mindful I can be of you, and the more mindful you can be of me, and the more you can almost relearn to watch me and pay attention to me and my state, the way I'm showing up, the more I naturally reciprocate and then become mindful and trained to watch, read, and gently help you manage your state and the way you make the micro decisions that cause us to ultimately deliver a good project or a bad project. So mindfulness is and has always been a social practice, but the last 40 years of the popularity of mindfulness training has only focused on the individual stress reduction and the individual self-enhancement. And we're now realizing that ultimately doesn't really work, because our reality is a social reality. And even though we are driven to compete, to be autonomous, as your previous speaker has said, we're also driven to collaborate. And the
Collaborate.
world of work today requires us to collaborate more than before. So the practices that I now have been focusing on for the last 6, 7, and 8 years, especially in British defense, are on mindfulness as team sport. Mindfulness as practice to almost relearn the stuff that happens organically to create psychological safety, collective resilience. And we're now realizing, and we're articulating more and more well, that team-based or team-focused mindfulness practices are actually a valid and reliable way to get teams to be more resilient as well as make good decisions and then perform in complex, ever-changing dynamic situations.
Almost a collective mindfulness, right? It's
Yeah, of
not
course.
it's not a like individuals. Like if I were to look at it from a perspective of, I know this makes no sense what I'm about to say, but just to visualize for myself, is that if you have this bunch of people, and if you were to give a score of, let's say, I don't know how we would score mindfulness, but imagine that you were to give a
You can.
score to everybody in this group, and with that, score as a collective, maybe we can come up with KPIs, or even predictors of success as a group of a given task, based on the level of mindfulness, not as individually but as a group that they're coming together, which is of course of what all businesses, or a lot of businesses, are looking for, like a way of predicting, way of understanding, way of um, simulating success, and how to change that, right? So effectively what you're saying is, I think what you said is, individuals, but as also as the collective, we need to be mindful, and that's the reality. That's where the real, like, as Spinal Tap would say, that's where things go to 11, right? In terms of that's thank you, that was amazing, that was brilliant.
Well, and Shirosh, this research has been done 35 years ago. So basically, even though we are not acting on collective mindfulness research, the collective mindfulness research has started in the early 90s by this chap called Carl Weick and his research partner Colleen Roberts, who explored highly resilient teams. So highly resilient teams in high reliability contexts such as nuclear submarines, intensive care units, or oil rig platforms, or air traffic control centers, need to be highly reliable. Because if you're not performing, if the individuals
Yeah.
in the group in the air traffic control center are not performing, somebody loses a limb, or an individual or a big group of people lose their lives. And so what Carl Weick and Colleen Roberts have found in the early 90s is, if a team of people who work together are collectively mindful, that means they are watching each other. And so the definition of collective mindfulness is collectively noticing detail in the situation that may result in problems, stress, or suffering, and then acting on this detail collectively means they can collectively manage difficulty and overcome, and then remain reliably performant. So collective mindfulness is a thing, and it's a scientifically measurable concept. But what most mainstream mindfulness training has not yet adopted
Been,
is
yes,
practices that generate people to become mindful of each other as opposed to just mindful of themselves.
myself.
The assumption of mindfulness training in organizations currently is that if I'm mindful of myself, that will seep into our social interaction and that will be contagious, and you will organically, maybe miraculously, become more mindful too, even if you don't practice thinking about the way you make decisions. But the irony here is practicing mindfulness by yourself is really hard. John Kabat-Zinn, the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, has said this in one of his publications. Mindfulness practice is actually an advanced practice. So for me to become mindful of how I'm speaking to you requires a lot of self-awareness. And so the paradox of individual mindfulness practice when I need it is that I have to have the awareness to even become aware in the first place. Do you see how that's a paradox?
Absolutely,
That I need
absolutely.
awareness to increase my awareness.
Awareness,
But
yes,
you,
yes.
Shirosh, you are watching me. You are probably very naturally able to say to what extent I'm too excited right now. To what extent am I cutting you off? So mindfulness as a team sport is actually something that we're naturally good at doing. But in today's world, we might have to learn this. So actually becoming collectively mindful is potentially more natural to individual mindfulness practice. And that's, well, this is the core of my research agenda, my public outreach agenda, and my almost influencing agenda, that mindfulness practice and mindfulness training needs to be more than individual enhancement and individual relaxation training.
And would you currently in your research have you already kind of made so the one of the things that in my experience working with organizations is that it's always kind of pegged to a dollar value, right? Anything that you say its value is of this, it doesn't have to be a proper number, but a ballpark figure, right? Have you already in your research, I'm sure you most likely have, that kind of come up with ways to quantify the value that mindfulness brings to an organization and the value in terms of dollars or pounds or whatever that it translates to? I don't know if I'm asking the right question, if that makes sense, what I just
You're
asked.
asking a really good question. Yeah. So there's very good research, solid, valid, and reliable, published in top management journals, research that says for organizations to have the culture and leadership to drive a collective mindfulness culture, investing in the culture and the leadership that generates a collectively mindfulness culture. And again, the two distinguishing factors of a collective mindful organization are that they anticipate stress and suffering as a team, and that they respond to stress and suffering as a team, as opposed to individuals managing with stress and difficulty by themselves. The return on investment on investing in creating procedures and processes to promote looking out for trouble together and addressing stress together, return on investment is clearly has been demonstrated scientifically. In my own work, I've run several trials of collective or team mindfulness training in the Royal Navy, and I have done a study with different types of decision makers, people entering the Royal Navy as officer cadets, senior decision makers, officers in high stress situations, almost as the bottleneck between those that report into them and more senior leadership. And so we've run several trials of team mindfulness training, but perhaps the most important evidence to suggest that being mindful of the interpersonal dynamics and how it pays to pay attention to how individuals and groups are mindful of each other has happened in a study that I ran for the Royal Marines a couple of years ago, where we noticed or we realized that the collective level of mindfulness or stress of training teams who are getting Royal Marine recruits through commando training, if the collective level of stress and almost lack of awareness of what the recruits need when they're going through the training to become a Royal Marine and get the Green Beret, if we're not aware of that and if we're not investing in lowering the collective stress of the training team members, recruits pass out. That means recruits are less successful in becoming Royal Marines. And so the Royal Marines have, based on that study, created a project where they got each new training team that trains new recruits joining the Royal Marines, or trying to basically going through training to become a Royal Marine, investing for a week in getting these training team members to get to know each other, to land on their feet, as opposed to facing a new cohort of recruits to take them through the 32-week of training. That has resulted in more recruits passing out. That means being successful in getting the Green Beret, the coveted Green Beret of the Royal Marine, than before. And so the important point here is that mindfulness training and mindfulness practice doesn't need to mean sitting in silence
Exactly.
and
Exactly the
waiting
point.
for somebody else to
Yes.
say something.
Yes.
It could be, and in collective mindfulness,
Yes.
it basically means we're creating a structure, we're creating a procedure, we're creating a process that gets people to learn to be mindful of each other and then to sustain their well-being and to collectively manage the stress in the system, as opposed to letting each individual manage their own stress by themselves, which we all know we all do not do as well as when we're responsible for each other and when we're responsible for each other's well-being. So the value for money, the bang for the buck, is absolutely there.
Absolutely. And if anybody is interested in to learn more about Professor Yutta's work and the work that she's done with Royal Marines, we everything will be available in the show notes as well for you to read and to, of course, to get in touch with with Yutta. Just to be going back to being disciplined. I need to ask you because otherwise I would be talking to you for like another
I
few
don't like
hours and
this.
like.
I don't like the discipline. Even though that's why I need mindfulness in my own life, right? Mindfulness is a mental discipline. Okay, focus. Where should we focus our attention? Okay, Siraj, tell me, where should we focus our attention now?
One of the things that we always want to encourage is the next generation, as it were, the next PhDs, the next the postdocs, and if you were to look back in your journey where you've effectively created a path for yourself, which may or not be the case for other people to do, maybe depending on your character, maybe there are a lot of things that would go into it. What would be maybe top three advice that you might want to give to PhD students, perhaps, or researchers who are probably looking at their journey and what to do in their journey?
Good question. I have at least two. Let me start and see if I get to three. One is focus in your research on the interdependent nature of reality. Focus more on that than you think. I think I have become more successful in my mindfulness research because I've focused on the interdependent nature of mindfulness, and I have been able to articulate this to the decision makers that I work with, that we're all much more interdependent than we think. And by experiencing interdependence, that means actually, having this community of wisdom, perhaps even, where we see each other clearly and where we understand each other deeply, we're becoming stronger. So if somebody wants to study phenomena and wants to really become an expert in any phenomena, becoming aware of the interdependent nature of that phenomena is probably going to be very fruitful. It also relates to probably the hottest topic in management science today, which is psychological safety. Psychological safety is the biggest driver of performance in our complex world today, recognized as the biggest driver of performance in a VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. Team mindfulness, or this idea of being mindful of each other, is probably, and this is what we're now proposing, is operationally equivalent to psychological safety. And so the way I train psychological safety in organizations is I train people in being mindful of each other as a team. So psychological safety and interdependence of people and groups is probably a sexy and very, very fruitful and also very productive way to put some sprinkle onto any research topic for a junior scholar. The second bit that I would like to, that I would want to have known myself more when I did my PhD is write more and have your thoughts. See your thoughts in written format more, and don't be so afraid of creating written or now podcasts or now other forms of having your voice heard. Nowadays, especially with the help of AI, we can practice articulating ourselves clearly and telling good stories about our work. Academic work is going to be absolutely irrelevant in 5 years, 10 years tops, if we're not becoming good storytellers. AI can help.
Absolutely.
And I wish I had learned this sooner. And I
Uh,
think I'm going to leave it there because I think those
yeah.
are the most important things. And the other thing I want to say is, it goes back to number one, work together with other people. The older I've got, the more I've learned and the more I've really nurtured relationships with others. One of them I'm nurturing right now. And one of my dear collaborators reminded me of this wonderful saying by Madeleine Albright. She said, there's a special space in hell for women who are not supporting other women. I think there should be a special space in hell for PhD students who are not supporting other
Supporting other
PhD
PhDs.
students.
Oh, absolutely true. I totally agree with that. Especially in my my experience when I was doing my
Mm.
PhD, I would 100% agree with that.
And the joke is that basically you win yourself by being pro-social.
Correct.
That's the joke about being
Correct.
pro-social, right?
Correct.
Uh, the more pro-social I am, the more I benefit as an individual.
Absolutely right. I
This is
mean,
mind
this
twist, right?
is this is I think for me, I think there is this is I have no real evidence, or this is very my personal experience, I would say, is that there is this STEM versus non-STEM, in research. There are certain STEM subjects like what I did, um, where people are much more happier to be in their rooms, or in their in front of their computer writing code or whatever they're doing, and it's not as so it's good to do what they're doing, of course, focus on that, but it's such an important thing to talk to people around you. It is irrelevant if they are not doing what you're doing, just to talk to people and get, it would just, I don't know, shake something loose in your head to on your work, right? So I would definitely, I totally agree with that. And I wish I did that more when I was doing my PhD. And that's something that I would definitely agree with. I want to go back. The question I wanted to ask you was, what is the next big challenge that you're tackling? But I want to, instead of saying that, I want to ask this question. We've talked about mindfulness. We talked about how mindfulness has translated, or can translate, businesses to a give a clear positive impact. Now there is this big topic that we've kind of touched on, is AI. How are you making that link between mindfulness, individual mindfulness, as well as collective mindfulness, and adding that layer of AI on top of that? What is the way that you're thinking about it?
AI is a mirror, right? AI is
Yes.
only as smart as we are.
Yes.
What we're feeding it then is brilliant at assisting us and organizing our thoughts, right? But it is currently not smarter than us. It's just more efficient than we are.
Yes.
I think I would like to talk about what I really want to achieve and what I want to achieve
Yes.
when I grow up at some point. So I work with Navy leadership, and I work with senior level military officials who are who have to plan for a very complex geopolitical situation. Many people, of course, talk to me about mindfulness not being appropriate to be in a military setting because we do not want to train people to become more effective killing machines. My argument here is always that mindfulness helps any individual become aware of how they can minimize harm and how they can maximize well-being. And so mindfulness is not about being peaceful, but mindfulness is about reducing suffering where possible and increasing well-being where possible. The important thing that I'm thinking about here is that we are potentially gearing up for an even more antagonistic world. We're potentially gearing up for even more military action between big blocs
Yeah, absolutely.
geopolitically. And so the military leaders that I talk to are effectively saying things like big conflicts are already in the making, big conflicts. We have to be aware of almost being ready for bigger conflicts. The thing that I discussed with them at that point is to what extent are we, rather than mobilizing our potential response to a geopolitical situation that is even more post-truth, even more antagonistic than 10 years ago, to what extent are we actually understanding what drives these big forces of antagonism? And so the big push that I think we should do and use AI as our mirror to organize our thoughts and to smarten and sharpen up our thinking is how can we understand that there are people in different nations and blocks geopolitically that see the world completely differently from us,
Yes.
and how can we build a bridge to connect? Because I'm absolutely certain that we are much more similar than we think we are.
Yes.
And if I see reality from a different perspective, or if I get people to invite me in to see reality from their side, I will see a connection. And I think that's where the money is,
Yes.
in smart knowledge generation and smart advice to senior decision makers. It's not about accepting that we're becoming more antagonistic and that we're now, we might be replaced by machines. But what is the fear based on, and what is the confrontations based on, and where can we kind of overcome the differences and see the connections? And AI can help us.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I've heard this story many times that British military, especially in places like Kandahar and other places, adopted this method of really changing the hearts and minds of people. They were doing much more uh, patrols inside, enemy territories, which was a great risk for them, but they were still doing it because they really understood the absolute value of getting in there, talking to people, understanding what their problems are, and as a result of that, I think there was a real huge positive impact in British military's work that they were doing in different places. So that really makes sense to me. And unfortunately, we are coming up to coming up to. I want to ask you just to get back to two different things. I want to ask, I have last two questions. And the first question is, you mentioned, of course, City, you mentioned um, Cranfield. I want to kind of highlight these organizations that have, of course, helped you in this journey. Can you tell us a little bit about City University as well as Cranfield that you've been working with, and how they have been helping you in this journey?
City St George's now. City has just merged with St George's, a medical school in London, and Cranfield are quite similar in their aspiration. Cranfield is a business school. Oh, I worked for Cranfield School of Management. That's a business school, and I now work for City St George's in the heart of London. And both universities have at their heart the aspiration to be close to practice. So Cranfield is all about translating knowledge into action, and City St George's is all about being the university of the practice, being close to practice, not being airy fairy in the ivory tower, but being where the hands get dirty and where we have to roll up our sleeves. Cranfield has been good to me and took me on as a very junior scholar. City St George's is very good to me in allowing me to develop a research agenda with the British Armed Forces whilst supporting me in not fully understanding what these partnerships look like and not necessarily forcing me to articulate where exactly the impact of this work will be. And by allowing me to explore where this research might go, I've had the latitude to work out where to generate the largest amount of impact that I've been able to generate so far. And I absolutely love being an academic as opposed to a consultant, teaching my students to be scientist practitioners who go out into the world, as well as working with with organizations to really understand their challenges and contributing to practice as well as to knowledge generation. It gives me a lot of pleasure to do this. And I think
Absolutely.
that's the unique position that an, an academic has who's a scientist practitioner working for a university that's close to practice.
Absolutely.
So I feel very privileged that I'm in that position.
Um, Thank you. That's as I being previously a Cranfield alumni as well. It's definitely I was in the different part of Cranfield, but that is still it's still valid. I think that as a whole, university is kind of
An
pretty
ethos,
much.
right? It's the
Exactly,
ethos.
it's really is, and they generate a lot of, they do a lot of work with industry as well as not just as you said, not being in the ivory tower as such, but really getting into the weeds and getting involved, and that's really important for university. And this is the last question, and I did not include this in the notes I sent you, uh, but I want to kind of ask you. You've, as you mentioned, you have been in this incredible journey, and you are effectively just getting started, really, because you have so many huge things that you will achieve in the next few years. The my question is, if you perhaps had if you want to thank someone, perhaps you did not have the ability or did not was not able to, maybe, if you want to thank someone, or can be few people as well, and to really say that, thank that person for being in your journey and really helping you, who would that be and why? And that would be really something that maybe if you'd like to share.
God, what a beautiful question. So three people stand out to me, and they've been pivotal to like kind of bends in my road, kind of decision points. So the first one
Absolutely.
is Carol Boudreau. I did my I finished up my PhD in Washington DC when Obama got elected, and I did my postdoc in DC as well just after Obama got elected. Those were the golden years in Washington DC. As I was finishing up my PhD, and I had just been to Rwanda once, this is 2006, 2007, I had read a blog, I had written a blog post, and which I put in the internet, thinking nobody reads blog posts. And this was 2007, nobody read blog posts. But Carol Boudreau, a professor at George Mason University, had read my blog post and invited me for lunch in Washington, D.C., because she was interested in my research. I had actually emailed her asking her for her latest article. She'd also been to Rwanda. She then wrote back and said, "Let's go for lunch." And I thought, that's crazy. I'm this nobody, and she's this well-published academic talking about entrepreneurship in Africa. We met at lunch. We met for lunch, and she needed a student to help her conduct a field study in Rwanda. And she basically took faith in me just because I'd done a student project there the summer before, and tasked me with running this survey, which became my doctoral dissertation, on the back of trusting me, having written a blog post and taking a chance on me. And that really opened so many doors that so Carol Woodrow is I was in my early 30s then, and her trust in me changed my complete trajectory. The next pivotal moment was when Professor Mike Bourne at Cranfield University allowed me to bring mindfulness into performance research at the Center for Business Performance in Cranfield. This was like 2011, 12, when mindfulness really wasn't well understood, and where the Daily Mail and Cosmopolitan magazine didn't really talk about mindfulness much. Mike just allowed me to explore and run a couple of studies that went nowhere. But because he's such a established, far-sighted professor, I basically was able to develop my wings in the field. And the last person that I think has catapulted my credibility and my standing in the British Armed Forces is Commodore Andy Cree, who was a Commodore in the Navy when I delivered my first research study in the British Army and the Royal Navy after I delivered it. And he basically enabled me to stay around the Royal Navy. And he said, make yourself useful. And he made a few introductions and enabled me to stay around after delivering a research report that didn't really go very far. But because of his encouragement, and he then prompted me to say yes to any opportunity. I said yes to whenever anybody wanted anybody to speak about resilience, mindfulness, or decision making. I said yes because he had created the path for me. That's how I think I've developed a network of people who were interested in my work, and it wouldn't have happened without these people. Thanks for
Thank you.
asking me this question. What a beautiful question to ask.
Thank you so much. That was so lovely. And first of all, I want to thank you for taking your time to out of your day to come and speak to us. That's so great. And sharing. I mean, for me, doing these podcasts, one of the best things I get from it is to talk to someone who is top of their game and to learn from them, right? And that's for me, it's almost like a personal tutorial session. So thank you so very much for that. And I hope you have a great weekend and speak to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.